The nurse had always imagined her last shift would be quiet, maybe even sentimental. After years of night duties, emergency codes, and skipped meals, she expected a few polite goodbyes and a silent walk out of the hospital doors. Instead, it became the most humiliating moment of her life. The termination came without warning, delivered in a sterile office with clipped words and practiced indifference. Budget cuts, they said, restructuring. No acknowledgement of the countless overtime hours, no mention of the lives she had stabilized with steady hands and sharper instincts than most doctors twice her rank. She returned to the ward wearing the same uniform she had worn for years, but it felt heavier now, like it no longer belonged to her. Whispers followed her through the corridor. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, afraid association might taint them. Others looked at her with shallow sympathy, the kind that never translates into action. A junior administrator asked her to hand over her access badge before her shift even ended, as if she might steal something other than the dignity already stripped from her. As she completed her rounds, every beep of a monitor felt like a reminder of how easily she had been replaced on paper. Patients who trusted her had no idea this was the last time she would check their vitals. One elderly man squeezed her hand and thanked her for always listening. She smiled, fighting the tightness in her chest, knowing the system had decided her years of service were no longer worth the cost of her salary. The real sting wasn't just losing the job, it was how small they made her feel. In a place where she had once been essential, she was reduced to a line item. The supervisor who signed her dismissal had never worked a double shift, never held pressure on a bleeding artery while waiting for a surgeon who was late. Yet his signature outweighed her entire career. That imbalance burned deeper than anger. It carved a hollow sense of betrayal. As the clock crept toward the end of her shift, she packed her locker slowly. Each item carried memory: a pen gifted by a patient's family, a worn notebook filled with emergency protocols she had memorized long ago, a photo from her first year in scrubs. She paused, wondering how something so central to her identity could be taken away so abruptly. There was no ceremony, no closure. Just an exit badge and a reminder to clear her email by midnight. Walking toward the hospital doors, she felt invisible. The building that once pulsed with purpose now felt cold and distant. She told herself this was how careers sometimes ended, not with recognition, but with quiet dismissal. She stepped outside believing this chapter was closed, unaware that the very people who discarded her were about to realize just how catastrophic their mistake truly was. To everyone inside the hospital, she was just another nurse, competent, quiet, replaceable. Her personnel file listed routine certifications, standard evaluations, nothing that suggested rarity. What it did not show were the years she had spent in extreme environments where hesitation meant death, places where decisions were made in seconds and mistakes were paid for in lives. She had learned long ago that extraordinary experience often stayed hidden behind ordinary job titles. She never spoke about her past. There was no reason to. The hospital culture rewarded hierarchy, not depth, and she understood that revealing too much could invite questions she didn't want to answer. Her calm under pressure, her ability to anticipate complications before machines signaled them, and her instinctive leadership during crises were quietly attributed to experience. No one asked where that experience came from. They simply took the results for granted. During emergencies, doctors often found themselves deferring to her without realizing it. She would position equipment before being asked, adjust medication dosages within safe margins, and stabilize patients while others were still processing the situation. She didn't seek credit. Saving the patient was enough. Over time, this consistency became invisible. Excellence, when repeated, fades into expectation. What the administration failed to understand was that her skill set went far beyond routine care. She had been trained to function when systems failed, when power went out, when supplies were limited, when evacuation was the only option. She knew how to manage trauma without full support, how to triage under chaos, and how to keep people alive while everything else collapsed. These abilities weren't part of hospital checklists, so they were never measured. Her dismissal was rooted in surface-level evaluation. A spreadsheet couldn't capture instinct, budget meetings couldn't quantify judgment sharpened by life and death stakes. To the decision makers, she was interchangeable with any newly hired nurse fresh out of training. The irony was painful. They believed they were cutting excess, unaware they were discarding their most resilient asset. Outside the hospital, her phone buzzed with messages she hadn't checked in weeks. Old contacts, dormant numbers, networks unrelated to her current job. They still knew who she was. They still remembered what she could do. While the hospital saw a cost to be reduced, others saw a capability that couldn't be replaced. She stood in the parking lot, uniform folded in her bag, unaware that events were already aligning elsewhere, events that would expose just how flawed the hospital's judgment had been. Her value had never diminished, it had merely been misunderstood, and soon that misunderstanding would turn into desperation, proving that true expertise doesn't vanish just because it's ignored. The first sound cut through the afternoon air like something unreal, a deep mechanical thunder that didn't belong to the quiet rhythm of the hospital grounds. At first, people ignored it, assuming it was distant traffic or construction. Then it grew louder, closer, forcing heads to turn upward. The nurse paused mid-step in the parking lot, a strange tightening in her stomach she couldn't explain. Instinct, the same instinct that had guided her through countless crises, whispered that this was not ordinary. When the first helicopter appeared over the building, conversations stopped, papers fluttered, security guards shaded their eyes, confused. Hospitals saw air ambulances often, but not like this. Not low, not fast, and certainly not with two more following close behind in tight formation. The wind from the rotors tore through the entrance plaza, sending dust and leaves spiraling. Panic rippled through the crowd as staff rushed toward the doors, unsure whether to prepare for disaster or evacuation. Inside, administrators scrambled, phones rang unanswered, no one had scheduled a landing, no alert had come through internal channels. The helicopters descended anyway, precise and aggressive, as if time itself were being chased. When the doors slid open, uniformed personnel poured out, their urgency unmistakable. They weren't shouting instructions or asking for clearance. They were asking one thing over and over, louder each time, her name. The nurse froze as her phone finally vibrated in her hand. A single message lit the screen short, blunt, and impossible to misunderstand. "We need you now." Her pulse quickened, every nerve snapping awake. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't coincidence. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the systems everyone trusted had already failed. Staff watched in disbelief as the helicopter's crews pushed past hospital leadership without hesitation. Titles, authority, and protocol dissolved under the weight of urgency. Someone stammered that she had been terminated minutes ago. The response was immediate and cold. That's irrelevant. In that moment, the illusion of control shattered. The people who had dismissed her value were suddenly spectators to a reality they could not manage. The nurse felt the familiar calm settle over her, the kind that only arrived when lives were on the line. Humiliation drained away, replaced by clarity. This was why she had trained the way she did. This was why she never panicked. While others argued, she moved. She turned back toward the hospital, toward the chaos now bending around her presence. The helicopters waited, engines screaming, time bleeding away by the second. Everyone could feel it. Whatever was happening was already late, already critical. The urgency wasn't theatrical, it was desperate, and for the first time, the hospital understood the scale of the mistake it had made. The crisis unfolding was bigger than policy, bigger than ego, and far bigger than budgets. As she stepped forward, answering the call without hesitation, it became painfully clear. Some emergencies don't ask who's on payroll. They ask who can save lives when everything else collapses. As the nurse moved toward the waiting helicopters, the shift in atmosphere inside the hospital was palpable. The same people who had dismissed her mere minutes ago now stood frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. The administrators who had signed her termination papers were suddenly irrelevant. Their authority crumbled in the presence of a crisis they could not control. Doctors who had questioned her judgment and colleagues who had whispered behind her back now watched as the nurse effortlessly assumed command without a single word of protest. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in the vicinity could feel it. It wasn't just her presence, it was the certainty she carried. Every movement was precise, deliberate, and calm, exuding competence that demanded trust. She coordinated the crew without explanation, anticipated the necessary equipment, and issued instructions with quiet authority. The helicopter pilots and paramedics followed her guidance instinctively, recognizing a skill set forged in far more extreme circumstances than a hospital ward could ever provide. Those who had previously overlooked her now realized that their assumptions had been dangerously naive. Their dismissive attitudes, their underestimation, and their failure to recognize her expertise had placed them at a disadvantage, and it was painfully clear who truly held the capability to manage the unfolding crisis. By the time the first helicopter lifted off, the shift was undeniable. The nurse was no longer the employee who had been humiliated in the office. She had become the center of control, the person upon whom everyone depended. Administrators tried to assert themselves, but their voices were drowned out by the precision of her commands. Doctors who had doubted her judgment were forced to defer to her experience, realizing that the hierarchy they had clung to was meaningless in the face of real competence. Colleagues who had once whispered about her incompetence now looked on in awe, their skepticism replaced by reluctant admiration. The reversal was complete. The undervalued nurse was now the authority figure, and everyone else was subordinate to her expertise. Even outside the hospital, the scene told the same story. Onlookers had gathered as the helicopters roared above, waiting for some indication of what was happening. When they saw her step forward, directing operations with clarity and precision, they instinctively recognized leadership. Her former humiliation became a stark contrast to her current dominance in the situation. The very people who had written her off were witnessing first, and the true value she had always possessed. Their regret was silent but evident, their earlier actions exposed as short-sighted and foolish. This moment of power reversal did more than correct past wrongs. It cemented her status in a way that words never could. Recognition came not from applause or praise, but from necessity, from the undeniable fact that she was the one capable of resolving the chaos that others could not manage. The lesson was stark and unmistakable. Competence, experience, and calm under pressure outweighed office politics and superficial judgments. In an instant, the nurse went from being overlooked to being indispensable, and everyone around her understood that they had underestimated a force far beyond their expectations. As the helicopters lifted into the sky, the gravity of what had just occurred began to settle over the hospital grounds. The nurse stood at the center of the whirlwind, her uniform slightly disheveled from the wind and commotion, but her posture calm, steady, unshakable. The same people who had dismissed her worth, who had reduced her to a statistic in a budget report, now faced the undeniable truth. Her skills, her instincts, her years of experience were irreplaceable. The humiliation of her termination faded in comparison to the overwhelming recognition of her true value, and the justice of that realization was almost tangible. Word of her actions spread quickly, first through whispers among staff, then over official communication channels, and eventually reaching local news outlets. The narrative shifted immediately. She was no longer the nurse who lost her job. She was the nurse who had saved countless lives in a moment of unprecedented urgency. Authority figures who had once ignored her presence now sought to commend her, to publicly acknowledge the depth of her expertise, and to apologize for their short-sightedness. The shift from invisibility to acknowledgement was complete, and it carried a sense of emotional closure that no formal reinstatement could match. For the nurse herself, the moment was not about vengeance or proving a point. It was about witnessing the alignment of truth and consequence. The very system that had failed to recognize her worth was now forced to confront its own misjudgment. She moved with quiet authority, guiding operations and ensuring that each patient and crew member received the precise care required. Her professionalism never wavered. It was the calm in the eye of the storm, the steady hand that turned panic into controlled action. And in that there was a profound form of redemption, the vindication of skill, of dedication, of years spent preparing for moments just like this. The emotional justice extended beyond professional circles. Colleagues who had doubted her, patients who had taken her care for granted, and administrators who had written her off now understood that true value often goes unnoticed until it becomes absolutely critical. Their awe and respect, though delayed, were sincere. It was a lesson in humility for those who had judged based on surface impressions rather than competence, and it reinforced a universal truth. Talent and integrity cannot be permanently buried, no matter how thoroughly ignored or dismissed. In the days that followed, the nurse's story became a symbol of recognition for overlooked professionals everywhere. Awards, letters of commendation, and invitations to speak about her experience poured in, but the deeper satisfaction lay in the moral closure she had achieved. She had endured humiliation, rejection, and doubt, yet when the moment came that truly mattered, her actions spoke louder than any words or judgments ever could. The crisis had revealed her worth to all who had doubted it, and in doing so, it provided a powerful, enduring lesson. Perseverance, skill, and quiet confidence are eventually recognized, often in the most dramatic and undeniable ways imaginable. Her redemption was not just personal, it was public, profound, and transformative. The nurse's journey from dismissal to indispensability proved that true excellence cannot be denied forever, and that emotional justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of asserting itself with resounding clarity.